I was thinking the other day about my teachers through the years. It's hard to imagine a human being who had teachers who were better to them than mine were to me from grade school all through college. I mean, it was just ridiculous, really, how kind and helpful they were to me. And, I could never quite figure it out. And then in 1978, I'm living in LA in that Scientology halfway house. And I walked down the street to a phone booth to call my mother, which I did periodically and often reluctantly. And when she answers, she said she just got off the phone with Mary Fowler, my kindergarten teacher. And I was sorry to hear that because I know it really irked her because Mary had my three brothers too. We all had kindergarten with her. But when she'd call my mother, the one she'd ask about is me. And that really pissed my mother off. So, I said, oh, I guess she probably just asked about me, huh? And my mom said, yeah, and this time I called her on it. She said, Rich, Chris, and Scott are all exemplary men, incredibly successful men, and all you ever want to know about is the wino. And, I just kind of let it pass. I hadn't had a drink in 3 years at that point, but it was just like, I also had like 35, 40 jaws by then. And when my mother would introduce me to people, this is Stephen, he's never had a job in his life. And, but then my mother said, and this time she told me why. And I said, well, really? What was it? And she said that when you were a boy, you had the highest IQ test, highest score ever recorded in San Mateo County. And, I remember I was smoking a cigarette and I just froze. And I made it a point to count to 10, like I often did with my mother. And I said, hold on. When I was in 6th grade, I asked you about the IQ test that Chris Scott and I had. And you sat us down and you told us that we were not only subnormal, but that we were so dumb that we were going to have to work our ass off all our lives just to keep up in school. And she said, how could I couldn't have done that. I didn't know what your IQ tests were. And I said, exactly. And then she said, and besides, as I told Mary, how smart could you be anyway? You're in Scientology. And I said, oh, she's got me there, But it was enlightening because, all those teachers who were so good to me, I thought I was charming, that it was my personality, but that obviously totally incorrect IQ score. I mean, I'm no Mensa character. You put me in a physics class or a chemistry class, and I'd be the dumbest asshole in there. But whatever that score was, it followed me for my whole academic life. I imagine every transcript that was on it. And it changed the whole course of my life. I don't know if that's what happens now, but if I was a teacher, I'd favor me too, instead of just some smart aleck clown. I was supposed to be some budding Einstein character. So when I was 12, we moved to Hillsboro, the rich district in that part of Northern California. And I went to Crocker Junior High, and my 7th grade teacher, Ray Yarbrough, and he was from the South, and he was a guy who specialized in grammar, and he encouraged us as students to write stories, then get up and read them. So the first week of class, that's what I did. And he came up to me and he said, I want you to stay after school. I heard this all the time. So I stay after school. I'm sitting there at his desk. And he goes, Stephen, I've seen your art. I've listened to your stories, and for a 12-year-old, you have some rather exceptional talents. And I said, oh, really? I was always surprised when people liked my art. I didn't think anything of it. I just did it to amuse other kids and to kill time for myself. So I said, oh, thank you, Mr. Yarbrough. But he said, but your grammar is atrocious. Did they even teach it at that last school you went to? And I said, yeah, sort of, I guess. And he said, well, you need a lot of work. So here's what I propose. I'm going to keep you after school every day and teach you the English language until you have it down pat. And I remember, it was so outrageous. It just sort of passed through me. And I remember looking at him and I was pissed because he had a flat top like I did, but he didn't have any of that pink wax in it or anything. He was just sort of a natural flat top, and it kind of irked me. So I was just staring at him and finally said, well, Stephen, he said, what do you think of that? And I said, well, I don't understand. Have I done something wrong? And he said, no, it's what I'm going to teach you to do right. And I said, well, I can still play sports after school, right? And he said, I'm afraid not. That's over for you. And he had this sealed envelope and he handed it to me and he said, please give this to your parents for me. And so I walked out of there both confused and horrified. I was used to teachers going the extra mile for me, but this was ridiculous. But I knew that my father was my staunchest defender, and he'd tell this guy to buzz off. So I went home. I didn't show the note to my mother. She would have been thrilled that I was going to be locked up in class every day. So when my dad came home, I showed it to him, and he opened the envelope, and he read it, and then he seemed really puzzled, and he read it again, and then he said, well, Stephen, it looks like you're going to be staying after school for a while. He said, what this Mr. Yarbrough has offered to do is really astonishing. He said, I've never heard someone, that's going to spend all that time tutoring a gifted student. I said, well, hold on. Well, wait. I said, what about flag football? What about basketball? I remember at 12, I was already as tall as my father. And he put his hand out on me, and he put it on my shoulder, and he said that thing that every young person dreads, certainly every young boy. He goes, Steve, this is what's good for you. This is the best for you. And I thought, oh, shit. So for the next 8 months, I stayed after school every day while Mr. Yarbrough at his desk or at the blackboard drilled me in the English language, conjugation, diagramming, pronouns, direct objects, indirect objects, transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, anything he could think of. And I was apoplectic with grief. I missed all the sports after school. I missed all the spin the bottle parties that kids were getting into then. And I'd be lucky if I got home every night by dinner. And I hadn't done anything wrong, And so this went on, like I said, for the whole year. And when he was done, I could have taught English myself. I knew everything you could know about it. And I did the rest of my life. And it was years before I realized what an extraordinary thing this man had done for me, giving up all those hundreds of hours of his own time for this one kid who repaid him with nothing but spite. So years later, I'm about 22. I just got out of the first mental ward. And it obviously didn't take because I'm living in a wino hotel, having bourbon breakfast. And one morning, I had too much of it, and I thought, it's time to go thank Ray Yarborough. So the school, the junior high, I knew he still taught there, even in the same room. So I walked the half hour up to the junior high, and I went to where his room was, and there was, glass, a window in the door, and I started knocking on it, and I had my face there, and he said, "I'm going to call the cops. I'm going to call the cops." And some kid was yelling, "Hey, there's some giant drunk guy out there." And I finally convinced him that it was me. So he comes out, he closes the door, and I grabbed him and I hugged him as hard as I've ever hugged a human being in my life. And then for good measure, I picked him up and shook him like I did Bing Crosby later. And then I put him down, and we both had tears in our eyes, me just pure gratitude, and him that he'd wasted all those hours on a wino.
Oh, what a saint.